Avatar 2 is upon us, and James Cameron is back to raise the bar yet again.
The bar has been lowered to depths we can't even fathom. If anyone can go down there and raise it back, it's me.
His name is James Cameron, the bravest pioneer.
Look, I'll level with you. Avatar: The Way of Water lives up to everything you've heard when it comes to spectacle. It's beautiful, often visually breathtaking, and yada yada yada, so on and so forth. Unfortunately, it's a film, and it's almost a copy and paste of the original movie as far as story, which means the writing is absurdly shallow, basic, and tedious. The movie's made with an indulgence allowed only to a top-tier director like James Cameron, and you feel it with its bloated, completely unnecessary 3.5-hour runtime, hampered by a meandering middle act. The visuals are so spectacular at times that I understand why people are eating this movie up, but the scenery is at its best during that ever so tedious second act, which is basically a montage of time-consuming pretty pictures that carry very little weight in terms of story. At least the dialogue is a mild improvement over the original films, but how much is that worth? The movie suffers from having far too many characters, and when the main cast being one-dimensional and cardboard cutouts, you can imagine what that means for the bloated supporting cast. Let's put it this way. 2 movies in, and after just leaving the theater, I couldn't even recall the main bad guy's name, let alone a single new character that had been introduced. Calling the film Avatar and seeing it in 3D is pretty ironic, because that's what everyone in this film is, an avatar, not a real character, not three-dimensional whatsoever, so that the technological achievement in front of you has a reason to be a movie and not just a pretty screensaver. For example, Sigourney Weaver's character seen in flashbacks is simply Sigourney Weaver. I noticed some reviews that whenever her character is mentioned, the authors seem to suffer from the same amnesia as me. Or perhaps, more likely, the screenplay doesn't do a good enough job at making us really get invested in what's happening on the screen. There are plot threads that are established and go absolutely nowhere, like when our heroes discover a character can't connect to Awa, the planet's great deity, or that character will die. After it's brought up, that's it. It's never mentioned again, and feels like something straight out of the cult classic The Room.
I got the results of the test back. I definitely have breast cancer.
With such an abundance of characters, it's probably not great that my favorite one isn't part of the main cast, but an alien whale. No, instead I walked away feeling like I did with the first movie, that this was a vehicle for Cameron to showcase how great filmmaking technology has improved, and stroking his own ego as something that only he, and he alone, can do. The Avatar franchise comes off as Cameron flexing his directorial prowess, powerful as it is. But with Avatar, story is secondary to the technical, and well, that just doesn't work for me. As to not spoil what's in the film, I'll do a surface-level overview of the plot, although it's so thin it's hard not to give the entire thing away with just a few sentences. What's insane is that after 13 years of waiting, Cameron's basically remade the first movie beat by beat. Continuing over a decade after the first film, Jake Sully, aka the only character's name I remember, has a family now with Blue Girl, and the bad guy from the first movie is back. Apparently a clone of his personality or whatever was stored by the company that's mining Pandora in case of his death, so they could place it in an avatar body and boom, he's back. So yeah, yay, we have our first method of undermining what happened in the original movie to have an excuse to make this one. Moving on, we have what I can best describe as a muddled motivation to drive the plot forward. In the original movie, they were mining for unobtainium.
This is why we're here. Unobtainium. Because this little gray rock sells for 20 million a kilo. That's the only reason.
To be fair, as stupid as it sounds, it is a real word. In Avatar 2, the reason behind mining Pandora has, for whatever reason, changed. There's a throwaway line about the Earth dying that's spoken so subtly and practically whispered as to be easily missed, and apparently that's the new driving factor for the movie to happen. But also, there's a new substance introduced later in the movie that they're trying to obtain too. It just becomes an unnecessary and convoluted set of motivations in a movie that's otherwise simple as shit. So yeah, boom, we have our conflict set up. Sully and Blue Girl leave their home with their family to hide with water blue people and learn their ways of living, and well, it's not a shocker what happens next. Bad guys exist, good guys exist, and they fight. Simple as that. It kind of goes like this. Act 1, reintroduce the bad guy. Establish where the good guys are. Act 2, watch bad guy and good guys learn new ways to fight each other. Act 3, they apply skill. They fight. But what's saddest to see is how much of a copy and paste this is from the original film down to actual scenes being filmed all over again. Not that you probably remember, because who remembers anything from the first movie? But when Jake Sully is first placed in his avatar body, he jumps up off of his hospital bed and frightens all the doctors and scientists around him. Well, in this movie, they do that again, but it's totally different because this time it's the bad guy who does it.
Same, but different. But still same.
In fact, the bad guy is basically taken Sully's role from the first movie, while Sully plays his role from the first movie again. I'll make sense of that. Cliche fish out of water story from the first movie where Jake learns the Na'vi ways? No problem. This time it's army bad guy learning what it's like to be a Na'vi, and Sully has to learn what it's like to be a Na'vi again, but this time it's how to be a water Na'vi. In the first movie, Pandora was being invaded for unobtainium. In Avatar 2, it's another resource. And the Earth is dying, I guess. The copy and paste story slapped onto new scenery amplifies how this movie just feels like a video game at times. The first movie was level 1, the jungle level. Second movie is level 2, the water level. And maybe part 3 will be the lava level, and 4, the snow level. I know this is coming off as harsh, but there were some highlights from the movie, and I want to be clear. This is far from the worst movie of the year. In fact, I wouldn't even say this is a bad movie, it's just not a good one, if that makes sense. One positive already mentioned are the visuals, which are undeniable in their scope, beauty, and aesthetics. I mean, what do you expect? It is James Cameron raising the bar, baby.
This is James Cameron. I am now at 16,000 feet. Oh, hey, James Cameron.
What the fuck?
I've been diving in the deep end, I'm feeling so cheap.
That's also the majority of the praise from people who love the movie, too. No one is complimenting the story besides a few emotional moments, and yes, there are a couple of those. Unfortunately, they play on the most basic fundamentals of human nature in order to evoke anything out of you, and the moments are fleeting at best. When a wild animal in the film ends up getting hurt, the movie plays it up, and myself and the rest of the audience are sitting there feeling the feels, because, hey man, an animal's getting hurt, that's not cool. But, I mean, that's exactly the point. No reasonable person likes seeing innocent animals being hurt. When you see it happening in a film, it gets you to say,
Hey, yo, what the fuck?
and that's the rub. The film is playing off that basic human element to get something out of you instead of earning it through storytelling. It's just some random animal in the context of the story, not really integral to the plot whatsoever besides being a device to nudge it forward. And instead of getting us to feel something for the characters, it evokes feelings out of you via emotional manipulation. I can understand why the characters themselves don't have time to get anything out of us, though. The story would actually have to make you care about them in order to make you care about what's really happening to them. I wanted to feel something for Jake Sully and his family, but whenever something perilous was happening, I felt oddly empty. Right after seeing the movie, a friend and I started an intense conversation about it. He enjoyed it, and well, you know how I feel. But anyway, I argued that the visuals didn't make up for the lack of story. His argument was that just because a story is simple doesn't make it bad, and I can't argue against that because I like John Carpenter's Halloween, one of the most simplistic narratives ever. Here's the thing though, a story being simple is not the problem. Yes, the original Halloween is simple, but like with anything, it comes down to how it's executed. In my opinion, a simple story can be elevated by great characters. A great story can make up for a lack of VFX, visual splendor, and a low budget. But a movie with great VFX and visuals simply cannot make up for a lack of a great story or characters. Visuals should be complementary, not the primary reason a film exists. Otherwise, just don't call it a film. Call it a theme park ride. Right, Martin? Going back to Halloween as an example, yes, it's a simple story, but everyone knows the name and characters of Laurie Strode and Michael Myers. These are not complex characters, although it could be argued that the latest films gave Laurie some greater depth, and I'm ignoring Halloween Ends, which is undoubtedly the worst movie of 2022. But Michael and Laurie are, or were at one time, unique original characters. Michael Myers was the first of his kind, and his first outing established an entire subgenre of horror films. And Laurie Strode is the first Scream Queen. For a film franchise that has the highest grossing movie of all time under its belt, it's kinda odd that Jake Sully and whoever the hell else as far as characters in these films have zero cultural impact. The only thing interesting about Jake Sully is discussing how you can somehow have the biggest movie of all time with such a dry, cookie-cutter character as your lead. That in and of itself is enough to make a strong case that Avatar, and this film as well, is more spectacle, an event, a thing to experience, like a theme park ride. The cultural impact argument is something you've probably heard a lot if Avatar's ever brought up, and that's because it's true. When you have to argue whether a film has ingrained itself in the cultural lexicon or not, when most conversations about it before the sequel came out started off with,
Hey, remember that movie Avatar? Papyrus, man.
then no, it fucking hasn't ingrained itself in the cultural lexicon. No one starts a conversation about The Dark Knight with, hey, remember The Dark Knight? You just discussed The Dark Knight. And what do we remember about that movie? We love the characters, the story. We remember specific moments. We break down scenes, situations, scenarios. And at this point, even lovingly break down plot holes. That's how deeply this movie soaked into our culture. What do we discuss about the original Avatar if it was ever brought up before the sequel finally came out? Do we discuss the characters? The story? Any specific wonderful scenes stick out in your head? Any iconic moments? Be honest. No, not really. I think the majority of people who saw that film remember the experience of seeing it and not anything in particular about the movie itself. And especially not the characters, least of all our lead hero Jake Sully. And the other characters in its sequel get it even worse than him. Our other lead, Blue Girl, is painfully underutilized throughout the entire film. She didn't fare well in the first movie, but here it's almost sad how little she has to do until the back end of the third act. For all of the terrible Mary Sue-style characters we've had this year, if anything, this movie goes the exact opposite route and wastes a potentially awesome, badass female hero. We get glimpses of it, including a glimpse of emotional weight from Blue Girl, but for a guy like Cameron whose filmography consists of some of the greatest female heroes in cinema history, from Sarah Connor to Ripley to Jamie Lee Curtis's character Helen Tasker in True Lies, it's odd that he doesn't do his female lead in Avatar 2 any justice whatsoever. He recently said that Avatar 2 would do more for female empowerment than any other movie or some bullshit along those lines. Nothing I saw in this movie proves that statement to be true at all. And as far as their kids go, it seems they exist solely to get caught in precarious situations to move the plot along. And they have so many kids that the film, even at 3 hours, doesn't have time, nor, I dare say, the inclination to develop any of them beyond shallow personality traits and cliches, which are standard of this franchise. This one's the little one who has the strong, mysterious connection with nature. This one's the disappointment. This one is the big bro they look up to. This one's the cute little straggler. And I swear to God, if I hear the word bro one more time.
The frequent use of the word bro by the male teenage characters had many viewers cringing in their seats. In the official discussion thread for the film on the movie subreddit, one user wrote, "Seems like an old man writing characters to relate to a modern teenage audience."
How do you do, fellow kids?
Our villain of the film, same as the last film, but different, is basically a fucking cartoon character, which befits a movie that's almost entirely animated. He's almost fun because he's such a caricature of the best 80s action movies, and at the very least he gets a little more development beyond the basic, hard-ass, cookie-cutter military man of the first film. I won't spoil what it is, but it does make his character more interesting. But it's not hard being more interesting than a pastry. The rest of the bloated cast fare even worse than our leads, and I mean shit. If the leads are bland and boring, what hope did we have for the supporting cast? The leaders of the Water Smurfs are basically Jake Sully and Blue Girl 2.0, except more dull, more bland, and just a more boring shade of blue. Cameron has sure been on a roll lately with talking up how incredible this film is going to be, mostly, of course, about the VFX, and yep, they sure are amazing. I've said so in this video like 8 times already, and it's definitely going to be the first thing mentioned in any review you click on.
You think he's dead? I hope so.
This is James Cameron. I found it. My God, I found the bar. 2% oxygen left. The bar is too heavy. Ah! Come on, you bitch!
For whatever reason, the MCU has been living rent-free in James Cameron's head for years now, which really doesn't need to continue. I mean, Phase 4 has been a disaster. But this dude has talked so much shit about the MCU and is so petty about needing to hold the #1 slot for highest grossing movie of all time that after Endgame passed the original Avatar just so happened to get a re-release the following year in China to bump it past Endgame. Come on, that's funny. But one thing stood out to me recently, and that was his comments about how the motion capture and CGI renditions of his lead characters would blow away what Infinity War and Endgame did with Thanos. After seeing the movie, I can tell you he is not wrong. And after seeing the movie, I also don't give a shit. If I had to choose between watching a scene with a beautifully animated Jake Sully or a scene with Thanos, know what I'd say? Bring me Thanos! Characters like Thanos are actually interesting. The portrayal by Josh Brolin was not just impeccable casting because he really brought Thanos to life, but the character was all around engaging and fun to watch on screen. You have 3 necessary ingredients to establish a great CGI character, in my opinion. There has to be a bar somewhere that dictates a level of animation quality to establish some semblance of believability or suspension of disbelief. Cameron can check that one off for sure. Then you need to have great writing to form it into a 3-dimensional, interesting creation. Cameron can leave that one unchecked. Don't even go near checking that box. And third, you need a great actor to bring that writing to life. Can you check that box for Jake Sully? Fucking no. In my opinion, this is another thing that underscores how little VFX matters when you don't have any of the other ingredients that make a great movie. Give me Gollum from Lord of the Rings any day over rewatching Jake fucking Sully and his cohorts run around being boring as shit. The animation of Gollum is nearly 2 decades old and shows its age now, but he's vastly more engaging than any character in this entire franchise. And what about themes? Well, there are definitely themes in this movie, and no one would be silly enough to call them thematic undertones. No, they're more blunt and in your face. There's nothing necessarily wrong with that either, but in the meta, I've seen some talk about the depth of this franchise's take on colonialism and nature preservation, and I think a lot of folks making these arguments are essentially equating themes with depth. A theme existing does not automatically mean a movie is deep.
Colonialism, natives, not good.
The first movie was all save the rainforest, the second movie is all save the oceans. I mean, Jesus, it's so on the nose that to show you how connected the Na'vi are to nature, they actually physically connect and plug into shit. It's an idea a toddler would come up with. The villains are unsubtle caricatures representing colonizers, and the native Na'vi are condescending, unsubtle caricatures and victims of said colonization. So if we're going this route, I think it'd also be humorous to point out the contradiction in utilizing this trope. Again, there's nothing wrong with using tropes, it's just the level of cringe you get when it's so blunt. I've also found it super humorous that Cameron unironically uses the white savior trope to be very anti-colonization. The white savior trope, also known as mighty whitey. Just funny to have both of these things. Here's an apt description of that trope from tvtropes.org. Mighty whitey, a common trope in 18th and 19th century adventure fiction. When Europeans were visiting and documenting vast swaths of the world for the first time, Mighty Whitey is usually a displaced white European who ends up living with native tribespeople and not only learns their ways but also becomes their greatest warrior/leader/representative. Does that sound familiar yet? In cases of the first and second, this trope can heavily overlap with led by the outsider. Led by the outsider trope is described as sometimes a people, group, or race's best hope comes not from within, but from without. In this trope, a group who is in a struggle against an antagonist receives a leader who is not originally one of them. In many stories, the leader is originally born from the opposing side and something drives them away from it. This developed dislike of their values or beliefs may have caused them to leave. In other cases, the leader may have formerly fought for or even led the opposing side. But after having seen the error of their side's ways, they decided to switch over to atone for what they'd done. Again, any of this sounding familiar? These tropes can sometimes have an ism attached to them, but can be avoided by simply not being dumb. The Last Samurai or The Matrix, which is one of the best films of all time, can be looked at through the lens of a mighty whitey or white savior story. But there's a difference. Those movies aren't condescending with that theme, and well, they don't suck. To wrap this section up, I just find it funny that there's greater depth to be found in dissecting a theme Cameron absolutely did not consciously intend, rather than the ones he did intentionally and unsubtly put in.
Mr. Cameron, we can't believe it. We're done here. Set course for the set of Avatar 2.
The pacing in this movie is atrocious at times and tedious at its best. There's absolutely no reason this movie needed to be as long as it is, and each of the 3 acts feel like they had different editors. The first act is just a collection of scenes trying to establish where each character is, utilizing the tried and true writing technique of blunt dialogue to tell us where everyone is instead of showing it. If that's the way you want to write it, that's fine, but when I was watching it, I was thinking about how easily they could have done this by just letting us see where the characters are and how they're living their lives rather than exposition dumps. A lot of things are shown, but not a lot of things happen in the first act, leading to some boredom, but man, if you're like me and thought the first act was tedious, wait until you get to the middle section of the movie. This is where the film comes almost to a halt, with montages of wonderful visual effects shots, but not much else. For what seems like an eternity, we get long shots of characters marveling at cool shit under the water that add absolutely nothing to the overall story. I'm not suggesting every moment in every film has to be leading to something, although I wouldn't mind it. That's just a tightly written story, it sounds. But goddamn, do these scenes go on forever. The third act is the saving grace of this movie, where Cameron stands alone as a director. The action in the final act is fucking awesome, but nothing is enough to make up for the blandness of the rest of the movie.
James Cameron doesn't do what James Cameron does for James Cameron. James Cameron does what James Cameron does because James Cameron is James Cameron.
It's in this final third where, in my notes, I made sure to mention a moment that encapsulates what's wrong with the pacing of this movie. A character rescues another character from the water, and in the context of the story, it's about the character's choice to save the other one, nothing else. But for some reason, what we focus on is the entire method in which they choose to save them. We have to watch exactly how they get him out of the water. It's dumb shit like that, prioritizing how something looks rather than what the script itself set up. This was a softball moment, something that could emphasize character over picture, but instead we get this extended, self-indulgent, and unnecessary scene that should have been 2 seconds long. Shit like this happens throughout the entire movie, helping to bloat its runtime for absolutely no reason.
His name is James Cameron, the bravest pioneer. No budget too steep, no sea too deep.
I think the tale of James Cameron is one of two careers, pre-Titanic and post-Titanic. Now, he's always been one arrogant son of a bitch, and I can't blame him for that, really. The guy has made some of the greatest films in history: Aliens, Terminator 1 and 2, and True Lies is an underrated and forgotten masterpiece of satire. But the level of smug emanating from Cameron since the late 90s has been choking people out for decades. In his pre-Titanic career, it seemed story and visual effects were emphasized equally. Terminator was original and brilliant. T2 is still to this day one of the best action movies, if not the best action movie ever made. And he was a forerunner in making incredibly badass three-dimensional female heroes. But now I hear things like,
well, of course the dialogue in Avatar is bad. It's Cameron. What do you expect?
What? Cameron was never Shakespeare, no, but his dialogue was pretty damn good. That was never a problem. The dude's responsible for writing iconic lines of dialogue. He could write Marines, he could write women, he could write comedy and satire.
That's it, man. It's game over, man. It's game over. What the fuck are we gonna do now? What are we gonna do?
I'll be back.
Have you ever killed anyone?
Yeah, but they were all bad. Come with me if you want to live.
Boy, I remember the first time I got shot out of a cannon.
Now, because his latest films have characters say dumb, corny shit, it's always been that way? Avatar is a trite, unoriginal, beautiful movie. I find it strange that he wants to have these films be the last of his legacy, as he is getting up there in age, but hey, if that's what he wants, that's what he wants. Audiences love this movie, but I won't be shocked if in a year it's completely forgotten about, and the franchise as a whole forgotten about once it wraps up. Avatar is a theme park ride, an experience, an event to behold, but nothing more. Popcorn movies are not a bad thing. I'm a massive fan of them, but that bears the question, maybe for another video. What actually makes a good movie? For me, it starts and ends with the story, and everything else is complementary. Avatar is great to look at, but it ends there.
Bye.